Good evening, everyone. I felt that on Sunday night, following my associate Jen Hodges' article that was published on Thursday morning, I had to give my take on the firing of CBS Scott Pelley. Now, before anybody starts clutching their pearls and drafting angry emails, let me say something that might surprise you. Scott Pelley is a talented journalist. He has covered wars, he has interviewed presidents, he has reported from disaster zone and conflict regions around the world. He has won awards that most journalists can only dream about. None of that is a dispute. But here's the problem. Sometimes people become so convinced of their own importance that they stop realizing that they're no longer the story narrator. They become the story. And that, in my view, is exactly what happened to Scott Pelley. For years, many Americans knew Pelley as the serious face of CBS News, the calm voice, the veteran correspondent, the guy asking tough questions. But over the past decade, something changed. Again, this is my opinion. The journalist increasingly became sounding like a lecturer. The reporter increasingly became sounding like an activist. And the man who once made his reputation holding powerful people accountable increasingly seemed convinced that him himself should never be questioned. That's a dangerous place for any journalist to end up at. Because journalism isn't supposed to be about us, it's supposed to be about the story. Yet in recent years, it often felt as though Scott Pelley wasn't simply reporting on Americans' political division, he was participating in them. And that's where the trouble began. Now, let's fast forward to what reportedly happened at CBS. According to multiple reports, Pelley confronted the 60-Minute executive producer Nick Bilton and the CBS News editor-in-chief Barry Wise during a staff meeting. Not privately, not professionally behind closed doors, in front of people. Reporters indicated he accused Wise of murdering 60 Minutes. Murdering? That's not exactly the language of a calm news discussion. That's the language of somebody who decides he's fighting a crusade. And here's where things get ironic. For years, Scott Pelley has portrayed himself as a defender of institutional journalism. Yet when leadership changed and institutions decided to move into a different direction, he apparently responded by publicly attacking the people running it. Think about that for a second. Imagine an employee walking to a company meeting and telling the new management they're destroying the organization. How many jobs do you think survive that conversation? Exactly. Now, does that mean Barry Wise is automatically right? No. Does it mean Nick Bilton's vision of 60 Minutes will succeed? Not necessarily. Responsible people can debate that. What isn't debatable is the management has the authority to manage. And according to the reports, CBS leadership ultimately concluded the relationship had become unworkable. Frankly, that's not shocking. What's shocking is how many media commentators acted stunned, as though a television star should somehow operate under different rules than everyone else. Apparently, some people believe accountability is wonderful right up until it arrives at their own desk. Now let's talk about Wake Forest's commencement speech, because looking back at it, it feels less like a commencement address and more like a warning flare. Pelley spoke about threats to journalism. He spoke about pressures on news organizations. He spoke about the importance of truth. And at the surface, many of those comments sound perfectly reasonable. The problem is that over time, some journalists begin convincing themselves that disagreement is oppression, that criticism is censorship, that oppression is the attack on democracy. And once somebody starts believing that, every professional disagreement becomes a moral battle. Every management decision becomes an existential threat. Every workplace conflict becomes a grand struggle for civilization itself. That's not journalism, that's theater. And the media industry has become far too comfortable with theater. What I find fascinating is how quickly some commentators transform Scott Pelley into a mantra. A mantra. Really? The man spent nearly 4 decades as one of the most powerful news organizations in the world. He earned millions of dollars. He built an extraordinary career. He became one of the most recognizable journalists in America. That's not exactly the profile of an oppressed outsider. What happened appeared to be much simpler. A veteran employee and new management collided. The conflict escalated, the relationship broke down, the company chose management, and that's not constitutional crisis, that's corporate America. And here's the broader lesson. For decades, Americans have watched journalists lecture politicians about accountability. We've watched reporters question CEOs about leadership. We've watched anchors demand transparency from institutions. Fair enough. Those are important responsibilities, but accountability can't be a one-way street. Journalists are not immune from criticism. News anchors are not immune from consequences, and television stars are not immune from workplace standards. If anything, they should be held at the higher standards because they spent their careers demanding exactly that from everyone else. Now, none of this means Scott Pelley wasn't a talented journalist. He absolutely was. None of this means he didn't produce important work. He absolutely did. But two things can be true at the same time. Someone could have a distinguished career, and someone can make a serious mistake. Somebody can be respected, and somebody can become a convinced on their own infability. Somebody can be a great journalist and still become a cautionary tale. In the end, Scott Pelley's firing wasn't really about politics, it wasn't really about journalism, and it wasn't really about television. It was about something much simpler. It's about what happens when public figures spend so many years asking questions that they forget one day they may be having to answer a few of them themselves. And for Scott Pelley, that day finally arrived. I'm Haylee Ficuciello for Englebrook Independent News. Good night.